Did you know that Napoleon Bonaparte was not actually short? In fact, he was around 5 foot 7 inches tall, which was average for a Frenchman in his time. But there's so much more to uncover about historical myths and legends that have shaped our understanding of the past. Let's dive into some surprising truths. First up, let's talk about Vikings. We often picture these fierce warriors with horned helmets, right? But here's the kicker. There's absolutely no evidence that Vikings ever wore horned helmets in battle. This iconic image actually comes from 19th century Romantic artists, not real history. Instead, they likely wore simple helmets made of iron or leather. This myth was a great marketing tool for Viking-themed merchandise, but it's time to set the record straight. Next, let's zoom in on one of history's most famous figures, Cleopatra. You might think of her as the epitome of ancient Egyptian beauty, but did you know she wasn't ethnically Egyptian? Cleopatra was actually of Greek descent, a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great. Her beauty? It's said to be her intelligence and charm that captivated Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, not just her looks. Now let's move on to a quirky practice from medieval Europe, the dancing plague of 1518. Picture this. In the summer of that year, residents of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, began to dance uncontrollably in the streets. This bizarre phenomenon lasted for weeks, with dozens, possibly hundreds of people dancing until they collapsed from exhaustion. Historians are still puzzled over what caused this strange outbreak. Was it mass hysteria, a reaction to ergot poisoning from moldy bread? We may never know, but it certainly challenges our understanding of mental health and societal pressures in that era. Speaking of misconceptions, let's talk about the famous story of George Washington and the cherry tree. You know the tale. Young George chopped down a cherry tree and confessed to it, saying, "I cannot tell a lie." It sounds wholesome, right? But this story was actually made up by biographer Mason Locke Weems to illustrate Washington's honesty. In reality, there's no evidence that this incident ever happened. It's a great moral tale, but it's not history. And what about the so-called Dark Ages? This term conjures up images of a time of ignorance and barbarism in Europe. But in reality, the Middle Ages were a time of remarkable advancements in art, architecture, and science. The period saw the rise of universities, Gothic cathedrals, and the preservation of ancient texts by Islamic scholars. The term Dark Ages is often used to describe a time that was much more nuanced and vibrant than it sounds. It was a period that laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and the modern world. Let's not forget about the myth of the Spanish Armada. Many people believe that the Spanish Armada was a great fleet that was completely destroyed by the English. While it's true that the English Navy defeated the Armada in 1588, the Spanish fleet suffered heavy losses due to a combination of naval battles and severe weather conditions. However, the Armada did not vanish without a trace. Many ships made it back to Spain, albeit in a severely diminished state. This tale has been romanticized into a narrative of total defeat, but the reality was more about strategic blunders and miscalculations. Now let's talk about the infamous witch hunts. We often think of the witch trials in Salem as the pinnacle of witch hysteria, but did you know that Europe experienced far deadlier witch hunts? Between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were executed as witches across Europe, often based on little more than superstition and fear. The American colonies, including Salem, were just a small part of a much larger and tragic phenomenon that reflected societal fears and the struggle for control during times of crisis. Lastly, let's unravel the myth of the ancient Romans and their supposed decadence. While it's true that some Roman emperors engaged in extravagant lifestyles, the majority of Romans lived in modest homes and worked hard to support their families. The idea of Rome being purely a society of excess overlooks the complexities of daily life in the Roman Empire, where commerce, engineering, and military prowess were key components of their success. As we peel back these layers of historical myths, it's essential to remember that history is often more complicated than the stories we tell. Each myth holds a kernel of truth, but is often shaped by the biases of those recounting it. Understanding the real stories behind these myths not only enriches our knowledge, but also helps us appreciate the depth of human experience throughout the ages.